we won't see another big tax and spend budget like this unless there's some kind of global shock and you have to react. But absent some kind of set of disastrous events you can't control, this is the big reset.
But this is it. This is the first budget of this parliament, and we had to reset. We had to wipe the slate clean. We had to bring out into the open all of the previous government spending commitments.
Because a lot of people are saying you're going to do the same next year and the year after.
No,
and you're
absolutely
saying
not. No, we have now set the public spending envelope for this parliament. We don't need to come back and ask for more.
Chancellor, great to see you. We wanted to get a sense of your thinking behind what is a very big and ambitious budget. And I wanted to start in the very ambitious programme of capital spending, which, if you meet the targets you set yourself, will, I understand, be the longest sustained increase in capital spending since the early 1980s. How long have you been planning this? And what is your sort of motive here?
Well, over the last few months, there's been arguments from people like Mark Carney, who used to be governor of the Bank of England, Gus O'Donnell, who was permanent secretary here before being Cabinet Office Secretary, Jim O'Neill, who was a Treasury Minister, saying, if you stick with the current rules around capital spending, we're going to miss out on big opportunities to invest in infrastructure and to crowd in private investment in things like energy and digital transformation. And so one of the things that I worked with Treasury officials when I got here is there ways to better count the benefits of investment and not just the costs of investment? Because unless we do that, we're going to, well, I inherited a trajectory for capital spending that fell from 2.6% of GDP down to 1.7% over a 5-year period.
And 2.6 already low by international standards.
Yes, and we're the only G7 economy with investment as a share of GDP, including private investment, of less than 20%. So something had to be done around that to turn it round. And I was very moved by the representations from people like Mark Carney and Gus O'Donnell. And I worked with officials here looking at what other ways could we measure debt that we take into account the assets and not just the liabilities. And that's why we've moved to a measure of net financial debt as our investment rule. And the investment rule is still that we get debt falling as a share of our economy, and we meet that in the third year of the forecast. But it does enable us to make those prudent investments in things to get our economy growing.
What's the kind of thinking then behind the heavy investment at the start and then it lessening off? Because one of the things we've been talking about is if you pump loads of money into the NHS, which obviously the NHS needs more investment, why so much so straight away and not kind of do it more slowly? Because isn't there a worry you might not have the right skills to be able to do the potential jobs, or even buying all the equipment, working it all out? People might just waste the money if they suddenly get it all.
Right. So one of probably the biggest challenge that I've had since I became Chancellor was that the previous government had these spending plans that they hadn't actually put in the forecast, hadn't actually budgeted for. And so a lot of the money that we put in yesterday was just to stop things from falling over, frankly, because there was this £22 billion black hole in what the previous government left us. They were spending that money, but they hadn't actually allocated any money for it. And so that immediate injection of cash in the first year is really to just buy out what the previous government were doing but weren't funding. So that's why some of this is quite front-loaded. Now, actually, over the Parliament, departmental budgets increased by 1.5% in terms of day-to-day spending and 1.7% if you take into account capital. So it's a much more generous settlement than what we've seen in the last few years for public spending. But the reason why it's front-loaded is that the baseline that we inherited was not honest. More spending was happening.
But that's on day-to-day, and capital is also front-loaded.
Yes, well, but it's similar.
So your explanation doesn't quite...
No, it is, Robert, because the previous government have over-programmed government departments. So they had plans for this capital investment. They just didn't set aside the money for it. I mean, it really is a disgrace, the state of the public finances that I inherited and the extent of the cover-up, that things were happening, but with no idea of how to pay for them. And we see that when we get the monthly borrowing figures, they're coming in 6 months into the financial year, £11 billion more than the OBR predicted in the spring. If you double that to take into account a full year. That's the £22 billion. It was being spent. It just never appeared in any government forecast until now.
I mean, we were quite keen today not to do the party politics.
No, I'm just explaining why.
And obviously we have to point out, as you just said it, that, Jeremy Hunt questions, the numbers, and the OBR have said 9.5 billion and all of that. But you are genuine here because a lot of people have commented on the front loading. It is because, frankly, you were clear when you reviewed each department that there was just a gap, and therefore you had no choice but to weight the spending, both day-to-day and investment, to the early couple of years.
Basically, what we're doing is we now have a baseline that's honest, whereas the previous baseline was dishonest, and it didn't take into account that things were happening, but there was no way of funding it. The previous government hadn't funded it. So we've now sort of readjusted that baseline, put the money in that was being spent. Now, we haven't put all of it in. We made around £5.5 billion of savings compared to that £22 billion gap that we inherited. But we've now readjusted the baseline. We put everything out there. We're being open and transparent. We're not sweeping stuff under the carpet. We have now wiped the slate clean, and we can now move forward with more sensible and more normal, although higher than the Conservatives, spending totals throughout this forecast. But that's why it's front-loaded. It just reflects that £22 billion inheritance. And,
talking of forecasts, obviously the OBR have put out their forecast for what they think is going to happen with growth. Are you worried about growth? Because, coming into this government, you guys were constantly saying it's about growth, it's about wealth creation. That's going to be what we build our economy on.
I absolutely want growth to be higher than what the Office of Budget Responsibility forecast yesterday. Growth for the next couple of years is quite good. It then falls back, and I want it to carry on at those higher levels. And
so does that mean that yesterday's budget is a sort of down payment, that you're anticipating there'll be important budgets to come next year and the year after?
No, the rest of it is not going to be about spending more money. It's about the reform we need to make. So already, one of the first things that we did, in fact, I made a speech in this room 3 days after becoming Chancellor, where I set out the planning reform to get Britain building again. We've made progress on that. We've called in a number of planning decisions. We're updating the national planning frameworks so that we can get Britain building again. That's not currently factored into the OBR's forecast. We need to do more work to deliver on those plans. Similarly, I launched in the first week of being Chancellor a pensions review to unlock the long-term patient capital in pension funds to help small businesses and scale-up businesses to grow and create wealth and jobs in this country. So we do need to make those growth numbers better. We've got plans in place to achieve that, but we need to see those through, and we're going to do that.
Just on that point about small businesses and growth. So I co-own a small business. We employ 25 people. And yesterday, once you'd spoken, me and my team were trying to work out what it all meant for us. And we're taking the brunt of this in terms of what you announced, with minimum wage going up, with national insurance contributions going up, with the changes in the business rate relief, and then on top of that, the working practice changes, and also, the cost of living crisis we're in. They're all things that impact us as a small business in the retail sector. And I'm not going to argue about whether they're right or wrong, the tax changes, but what should we be doing as a business now? Because should we be employing fewer people? Should we be investing less? How do we take on that burden you've just given us?
Well, I think that's a fair challenge. We published yesterday a corporate tax roadmap. So if your business is making profits, then we've committed to cap corporation tax at 25% for the duration of this parliament. No more chopping and changing.
Yeah, we're not that big.
You have certainty. Well, but you make a profit.
Yeah.
That corporation tax is now capped at 25% for the rest of this parliament. The full expensing and the annual investment allowance and the research and development tax credits, they're all staying, and we've committed to them for the duration of this parliament. On business rates, if you are in retail, we have extended by a year the business rates relief at a slightly lower level, but under the previous government...
It's a big difference. It was 75% and it's gone down to 40%.
Fine, but up until yesterday, you thought it was going to zero because that was in the plan. So we have got rid of that cliff edge. It comes down, but more gradually.
Yeah.
And we've also published a consultation to look at how we can change the burden of business rates so it works better for small businesses and high street businesses. And look, for the smallest businesses, 1 million of the smallest businesses, not yours, because yours is bigger than that, but for 1 million smallest businesses in this country, they will pay either less national insurance or the same as what they would previously do. As you get bigger, look, we are asking businesses to contribute more in terms of national insurance contributions, because if we didn't, we would be in a position where our public finances would not be on a stable trajectory.
Yeah.
And as a business, you saw over the last few years, interest rates go through the roof. And that affected both your ability to borrow, but also how much money your customers had in their pockets. We've committed to bring stability back to our economy, to end the chaos and instability we've had the last few years. And that commitment to business, I think, is really important. But I do recognise we're asking you to pay a bit more in tax, both to get our public finances on a better trajectory, but also to fund the additional appointments in the NHS to bring those waiting lists down.
And I'm not arguing that, but what have we got to look forward to then in terms of, because, if we take all this burden now, and it is going to be, it's not just a little bit, it's quite a substantial increase in our costs. And I appreciate, you said at the beginning of all this about the broadest shoulders need to take the hit, but what's the incentive, and when will it be like, oh, it was worth it because our economy's growing a lot more, because we're not even hearing that. So that's and I'm not trying to do a political argument with you. It's more just this is a genuine thing happening for lots of businesses now, trying to work it out.
You say implicitly you're a bit disappointed with the OBR's projections. I mean, I think...
Oh, no, I'm fine with the OBR projections. We need to do more as a government to grow the economy. And we've got the plans in motion.
So you accept
the
their
OBR
projections. You've just got to create the conditions.
We've been in government for less than 4 months, right? And already in that time, we have managed to bring the stability back to our economy. We've announced big infrastructure projects and investments. Through our International Investment Summit, £63.5 billion private sector investment coming into the UK. Do we need to do more? Absolutely. We're only 4 months in.
But just on that, because there was something you said earlier, which I just wanted to confirm that I understood. This, I think you implied, was in terms of big tax and spend, this was the moment. And in terms of further measures to stimulate growth, we won't see another big tax and spend budget like this unless there's some kind of global shock and you have to react. But absent some kind of set of disastrous events you can't control, this is the big reset.
But this is it. This is the first budget of this parliament, and we had to reset. We had to wipe the slate clean. We had to bring out into the open all of the previous government spending commitments.
Because a lot of people are saying you're going to do the same next year and the year after.
No,
and you're
absolutely
saying
not. No, we have now set the public spending envelope for this parliament. We don't need to come back and ask for more. We've now set that. We're going to do a zero-based review to make sure we get value for money for every pound that taxpayers' money is spent. We've got to drive reform and efficiency and change in the way we run our public services. But my focus now is on economic growth.
And just to be clear, when the IFS says your spending envelope is unrealistic, you just think they're wrong.
I don't accept that. We've now set that envelope. We've reset the baseline for this year. And if you take the Parliament as a whole, I think it's 1.5% increase on average per year in day-to-day spending, and 1.7% if you take into account capital spending. So this is no return to austerity. These are real terms increases in departmental spending, but we've now got to live within our means. We've made that reset. We want to give businesses and families certainty that they can plan for the future, that we're not going to be coming back to this in a few months' time. And I'd just also say this, we've also committed now to have annual budgets, not twice a year like the previous government was doing. And again, that should give reassurance to families, to businesses and to investors that we're not needing to come back for more. We will do the spending review in the spring, based on the spending envelope we set yesterday.
Are you worried about inflation at all? And the fact that, if, for example, businesses do pass on these increased costs to customers, that's going to push up prices. And the point is, inflation could go up, couldn't it, from all of this?
Well, I was an economist at the Bank of England at the start of my career, and so I think I'll always be very vigilant about inflation. And inflation reached more than 11% in the last Parliament. In this Parliament, I think the peak year, the OBR forecast inflation will be 2.6%. So it has come down substantially. We need to keep it down because inflation takes money out of people's pockets. We did increase the national living wage and the national minimum wage yesterday. It's important to do that because people on the lowest incomes have been struggling most of all with the cost of living crisis. I was proud that we were able to accept those recommendations from the Low Pay Commission, but we have got to keep a tight grip of inflation, and I'm determined to do that. And yesterday we set the remit again for the Monetary Policy Committee to meet that 2% inflation target.
I mean, interest costs, however, are a massive burden. You inherited very big debt. It is going up. It's going up 32 billion a year, according to the OBR's calculations. I remember, I'm afraid I'm old enough to really remember the obsession of Tony Blair and especially Gordon Brown as both Shadow Chancellor and Chancellor in driving debt down. And in his first term, and it seems like a different world, he actually got the ratio of public sector debt to GDP down to quite close to 30%. I think it was something like 31%. We were now at 100% on that measure. Every year, according to the latest forecast, you'll be shelling out something like £120 billion just to pay the interest on this debt. Is there anything you can do? I mean, that's such a lot of money that could be going on schools, on hospitals, on stuff that really directly benefits people's lives.
Well, that's the situation that we have inherited. Over the course of this Parliament, in fact, in the third year of this Parliament, we meet our two fiscal rules. The first is our stability rule. And our stability rule is that we will not borrow to fund day-to-day spending. Day-to-day spending will be paid for through tax receipts. The last government weren't even targeting that, let alone meeting it. That's really important.
But it must be a source of anxiety to you, this enormous interest burden.
It's really important for fiscal sustainability that we pay for day-to-day spending with tax receipts. But our second rule, our investment rule, does get debt down as a share of GDP. And again, we meet that in the third year of the forecast. But being able to invest in infrastructure and get a return for taxpayers is a good use of public sector money, as long as it's spent prudently, and we will make sure it is.
At which point then do you think we'll be able to judge the success of this budget? Like, when are you thinking we'll, I don't know, feel happier or feel wealthier or whatever? What's going on in your head in terms of when we can make a judgment about it?
I hope that in this budget that people will feel we've done everything in our power to protect the living standards of ordinary working people, that if they're on an NHS waiting list, there's a chance that they'll see a doctor a bit sooner, 40,000 extra appointments every single week. If you've got a kid at the local school, there'll be more qualified teachers in the classroom, and we'll be able to rebuild our schools after so much neglect, and we'll start building the homes our country needs. That's what I hope people saw that I was prioritising in the budget yesterday.
So when? Go on, tell us when you think.
Well, let's take one of those, which is probably most important to a lot of people, 40,000 additional appointments every week. We will achieve that in the first year of this Labour government.
So they will be 40,000 in the first year?
We will achieve 40,000 additional appointments every week in the NHS in the first year of this Labour government.